All right, so when we exercise early on, we quickly deplete much of our creatine phosphate because it's being used to resynthesize ATP in the very beginning of exercise. And if we're exercising to exhaustion, high intensity effort, we can completely or nearly completely deplete it. And ATP, even though we say we only have seconds of ATP to use, we never completely deplete our ATP resources because we quickly switch over to creatine phosphate. So to resynthesize or restore our resting ATP values usually takes within 3 to 5 minutes of rest. And then we, same with our creatine phosphate, completely restore or resynthesize creatine phosphate to our resting values in 8 minutes. And this is much of the idea behind when individuals are doing resistance training and they're training for strength, they have longer rest periods between sets to allow them to restore much of their ATP and creatine phosphate so that they have these high intensity energy stores, quick energy stores available for the maximal lifts. So for strength training, they usually use heavy resistance, lower repetitions, and so ATP and creatine phosphate are the primary source. So we want those values resynthesized. We want those values available. We want those substrates available in the muscle to be the primary energy source. And our muscle glycogen is our backup storage for glucose. And when we are depleting our blood glucose, we go to either our muscle or liver glycogen to break down and make more glucose available. And it's very important for us to restore our glycogen values after depleting them so that if we are training the following day, we have available energy so you can maximize your training the next day. If you don't have enough energy available the next day, you haven't restored your glycogen, you're not going to work out as intensely and then you're not going to get as great a training effect. So training and diet have a great impact on our glycogen stores. Glycogen is can be our energy source for glycolysis, but also when we're in aerobic energy production or aerobic energy production. As I've mentioned before, that when we're producing energy aerobically or oxidatively, at higher intensities of aerobic energy production, we use glycogen, whereas at lower intensities we use more fat. And our liver glycogen versus muscle glycogen, our muscle glycogen is used for the most intense aerobic energy production, whereas liver glycogen is more for the lower intensities. Muscle glycogen isn't only depleted with types of activities such as running and things like that. It can also be depleted if an individual is lifting weights and they are doing high sets, that they have an extended training session, and then they can deplete their glycogen. It usually takes about 24 hours to restore our muscle glycogen, and that's why it's recommended that athletes have a carbohydrate source within 15 to 30 minutes of completing their exercise session, because that quick ingestion of carbohydrate is going to help us restore the glycogen further. And when we talk about energy production, we have two ways of measuring the amount of energy we produce. And direct calorimetry is where we're actually measuring the heat produced. And you go into a heat chamber, and it's an insulated chamber, and it actually detects the change in the temperature in the room as a result of the body heat produced with exercise. And when we do oxygen consumption, that's considered indirect calorimetry. and that's where we're measuring the amount of oxygen that an individual consumes, and then we're converting that to the amount of kilocalories or energy that is produced. And the way we can convert is we know that 1 liter of oxygen is equivalent to 5 kilocalories of heat production. And so indirect calorimetry, another thing we look at when we do oxygen consumption is we measure the amount of CO2 produced versus the amount of oxygen consumed. And this gives us what's called our respiratory exchange ratio. And we divide the volume of CO2 produced by the volume of O2 consumed. And this is an indication of what substrate we're using. And so when we have an RER of 0.7, it is reflective of that we're using fat or aerobic energy production. Whereas when we get up to an RER of 1.0 or greater, it tells us we're using carbohydrate oxidation, and it is reflective more so of anaerobic energy production. And it's used as an indicator to know that when we do an exercise test, that we have achieved a person's true VO2 max. So our VO2 max increases as we endurance train. That's because our heart gets stronger, but also there's a lot of changes in the local muscle bed, increased mitochondria, myoglobin, enzymes that make the muscle able to produce energy oxidatively. But when VO2 max is not the main indicator of athletic performance, it's lactate threshold in relationship to the VO2 max. Because if two people have the same VO2 max, the person with a higher lactate threshold is going to be able to maintain higher intensity effort while fueling their exercise muscles oxidatively without producing as much lactate, or they have a greater tolerance for lactate. They can clear the lactate. And so we use lactate threshold and not just VO2 max as an indicator of athletic performance. We also train at the lactate threshold in an attempt to extend or raise their lactate threshold so that a person can stay aerobic longer. Okay, so another concept in your book is what we call oxygen debt and EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Oxygen deficit is the amount of oxygen, we compare the amount of oxygen that is required to fuel that exercise versus what the amount of oxygen we're actually taking in. And the oxygen deficit is at the very beginning of exercise. We are not consuming enough oxygen at that early stage of exercise to fuel that intensity of effort. And so we have a deficit of oxygen, and the energy produced is more through anaerobic means. And then excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is the increased respirations. Even after we stop exercising, you're consuming more oxygen, and yet you don't need that oxygen to fuel the exercise because you're at rest. And so much of the restoration, metabolizing lactate, restoring ATP occurs during that EPOC, or that elevated oxygen consumption. And this is just a graph that demonstrates when you're exercising, you have a certain amount of oxygen requirement to fuel that exercise. And the deficit is the oxygen that we don't have that much oxygen available, and that's where anaerobic means are fueling the exercise. Steady state exercise is just where the amount of oxygen that's required we are consuming. So we're meeting our needs for oxygen to produce energy at that level of intensity. And then EPOC, you can see at the end, is even though exercise has ended, and so we don't need that increased oxygen to fuel our, produce ATP, we still have this elevated oxygen consumption. And there again, it's to refuel the body, ATP, and metabolize lactate, hormones, and restore hormones, and return the body to its normal resting state. And the more intensely we exercise, we're going to have a greater EPOC. It's going to be extended out over a longer period of time. And there again, steady state exercise is just a comfortable state of exercise with where our oxygen consumption equals our oxygen demand. And so we use these principles of energy systems when we design training programs. And so an athlete who is a long distance runner, they want to do definitely some steady state running to increase the oxidative capacity of their muscle, but they also want to train on other days where they're close to their lactate threshold, so that they bump up or extend out their lactate threshold so that they can maintain oxidative energy production longer. And so our training programs are very specific to the type of event that we're doing and the energy system that is dominant during that energy system.